I want to begin today with a story. I uh, first came across a story this week, so hopefully I have the details correct. If not, sue me. I'm trying to make a point with it anyway, so whatever. There's this guy named Ernest Shackleton. He's a good looking guy. Look at this guy. I mean, come on. They don't make them like they used to, right? Ernest Shackleton. I have no idea what I'm doing today. Ernest Shackleton. hmm, Ernest Shackleton in 1914 set out on the ship the Endurance with 27 other men to achieve a lifelong goal that he had had. That lifelong goal was to cross Antarctica by foot. Not on my bucket list, not going to lie to you, but that was his desire. And so he and 27 men set out for Antarctica. But before they even reached the shore, the Endurance got locked in an ice pack. And the ice pushed in on the hull of the ship, and there was no movement to be had. Day after day and week after week, the ice tightened in on the ship until the pressure got to be too much. And the ship that was supposed to carry them to the shore of Antarctica to help them get back began to sink. And so, as the pressure got too much, the hull began to crack and it sank. 27 men now. No ship, no radio, and no rescue coming, just ice. Just ice. Now, I want you to think about that for a second. These are not men who signed up to be beached on some ice, not even making it to Antarctica. These were men who signed up to do a world first, who were going on an expedition to do something that no one had ever done before. They signed up for adventure. They did not sign up to watch their ship sink and figure out how to survive on a floating sheet of ice in the middle of nowhere with 60 below degree temperatures and with no plan in 1915. But that is where they were. So they did what you do. You make camp. You eat what you can catch. You survive. You keep one another's spirits up as best as you could, and you wait. Eventually, at some point, Shackleton decided he and 5 other men were going to go and look for help. And so he decides that he's going to get on a lifeboat that they managed to salvage, and they're going to point it towards South Georgia Island that is 800 miles away. And to do so, they were going to have to cross the Drake Passage, which is arguably the most dangerous stretch of water in the ocean across the planet. Before he left, Shackleton looked at his men and he said, "I will come back for you." And then he was gone. Here's what I find fascinating about this story. For 4 months, those remaining men sat on that ice and they held on. Not because the conditions got better. It's not like, oh, it's summer now in Antarctica. Not because rescue was visible on the horizon, because it wasn't. They held on because they believed that somewhere out there was someone who cared about them and was going to be good on their word and be faithful, and that person was out there still moving and still fighting and still coming for them. Shackleton made it to South Georgia. Now he had to cross mountains on foot with basically nothing, and he made it across. He and those 5 men found a whaling station. And they mounted rescue attempt after rescue attempt after rescue attempt until finally the ice let them through. And then August 30th of 1916, Shackleton returned. And every single man was alive. I think that is one of the most remarkable survival stories in human history. And I think one of the reasons that those men survived has less to do with toughness and looking like that. I mean, that didn't hurt. but they had something to hold on to. Someone had gone ahead and had promised to come back, and they believed him. They couldn't see the progress that Ernest Shackleton and the other 5 men were making. They couldn't track him across the ocean. They didn't have a GPS tracker planted on the boat. They didn't know. They had no updates and no signal, no confirmation that he was even still alive. All they had was his word, and his word was enough. And I want you to ask something. I want to ask you something that I want you to sit with for a second. What do you do when you find yourself sitting on the ice? What do you do? I'm not talking about like going and buying an ice cube and sitting. No, I'm talking like when your life is on hardship, when your plan, that was a good plan, that was the right plan, doesn't survive contact with reality. And then the cold sets in and the horizon is empty. And you're not sure how much longer you can keep doing this. What do you do then? I don't know about you, but I think some of us may feel like you're on ice now. And some of you may feel like you've been on ice for a while. So where are you looking? What are you holding on to? The author of Hebrews, the pastor of Hebrews, it's been one of the most challenging parts of the sermon series is not knowing what to call him. So I'm going to call him the pastor of Hebrews today and try to stick to it. The pastor of Hebrews has something to say about that because he knows something about peoples whose faith was on ice. And I think what we're going to talk about today might change your mind of the road ahead and how you sit on the ice. And I think that the pastor of Hebrews wants us to keep in mind that you are not the first one on ice, and you won't be the last. Open up to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. As you turn there, we've been walking through all of these arguments of greater than, and we find ourselves here in chapter 11. There's only chapter 11, 12, and 13 are the last chapters in this letter. So we are coming to a close, and these are the words that we find. Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for, and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. The pastor of Hebrews then does something fascinating. The rest of this chapter is building of a case. He goes back through the whole story of the Old Testament, of God's people, and he pulls out name after name after name after name. Pulling on story after story, he talks about Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Moses and Rahab and Gideon and David and on and on and on. And next to every single name, he puts two simple words. By faith. By faith. By faith they did this. By faith they survived that. By faith they kept going when everything else said stop. Some of these names and some of these stories you may know. You may have talked about Gideon and the fleece in Sunday school or at a VBS. But some of them you may not be as familiar with. If that is the case, we'll move back to this, but I want to encourage you to use this as a reading guide for yourself, to go back and see the stories that the pastor of Hebrews is highlighting here. Because when you read them and you know the stories that are behind the names, these two words of by faith will hit completely different. But here is where this chapter and the pastor of Hebrews is building. This great hall of faith, the faith in action is what this is called in my Bible, but I call it the hall of fame of faith. These characters aren't listed by the pastor just to show off his biblical knowledge. It's not spiritual or theological flexing. The pastor of Hebrews does this like he has done over and over and over again. He does this to remind, to encourage, and to spur on the reader to not drift, but to stay faithful. Do not fall away. Because look at these people who did not fall away. Look at these people's faith, that by faith they made it through. To the pastor of Hebrews, it is more important to be reminded of the giant shoulders that you stand on, and then leaning on those faith giants can lead you to a life that is not caught in the sway of drift of to and fro, but you can be anchored in your faith to something more solid. Notice how the next chapter, chapter 12, carries continue forward from the hall of faith. The first word is therefore. Every corny Bible preacher, every corny teacher, Darren's whispering it in his wife's ear. Whenever you're reading the Bible, if you come across a therefore, you need to know what the therefore is there for. This therefore is referencing this hall of faith. In summary of these people that we've just read about, therefore, and he continues in chapter 12, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before us, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. This is the message that you are to take from this great hall of faith. The author of Hebrews, the pastor of Hebrews has turned the corner from theological exploration, from arguments about the greatness of Jesus Christ. And now he's into application. Chapter 11, 12, and 13 stand as a synthesis of the greater thans of this whole book. All of the building has come to these ideas, that we would continue and not give up, that we would not grow weary, that we would not live lives hindered by sin and not be thrown to and fro by the distractions, and instead that we would look to Christ, even if we are facing hardships, especially when we're facing hardships. That too, God can use those hardships to discipline us and discipline our souls and spirit in our lives, to help us to grow and mature into holiness, righteousness, and peace. That is how he continues on in the rest of chapter 12. And the plea of the pastor's heart is to encourage the flock to not abandon the shepherd. Don't leave the sheepfold. Don't give up. Continue in the race. Don't be hindered. Do not fall into the cheap snares that the enemy has placed in front of you that would tempt you to abandon your inheritance. The pastor says, you are not the first one on ice, and you won't be the last. You're not alone in feeling like you're on ice. You're not alone in feeling the temptation to just go and throw up your hands. You're not the first one to think about throwing away your inheritance. The author of Hebrews doesn't leave his people with inspiration alone. The pastor leaves them with directions. Throw off what hinders and run with perseverance and fix your eyes. These are not feelings, they are decisions. These are decisions that you need to make in your daily life. These are decisions that we have to make. We have to make sure that we are throwing off what hinders us. We have to make sure that we run with perseverance. We have to make sure that we are fixing our eyes. These are practices for ourselves. And I think the question that's before us today is a simple one. How do we do that? How do I do those things? How do I throw off what hinders, and how do I run with perseverance, and how do I fix my eyes? Dallas Willard, who you've heard me quote probably 1,000 times, used to say that you cannot do in the moment of crisis what you have not practiced in ordinary moments. I was in a class at college I shouldn't have been in. I don't know why the prerequisite was only a freshman level class. I walked in, it was my only ever night class that I had. I walked in, and it was a capstone class for 2 students with their Masters of Divinity, and then 2 other students who were a capstone for them in philosophy of religion. And here comes Aaron on a little small penny board, because why not? Everyone else had long boards. I had to be different. So then I come in here to this night class, and Rich Knopf teaches the 5 of us. And he was talking about the problem of pain, the problem of hurt. And he said, the time to get your heads and hearts wrapped around this is not when you're in the midst of hurt and in the midst of pain. But the problem is, so seldom do Christians do that. They knit together their theology of pain when their hand is forced. I think it's the same thing with this. We have to seek out the ordinary. Practices in the ordinary life when storms' lives aren't raging, when the seas are quiet, when the ship isn't beached on ice, so that you are ready and prepared for when they are. The reason that the military, the men and women of the military, train the way that they do. I come from a long line in my family of military people. My grandfather was in the military. My great aunt was a brigadier general in the Air Force. My oldest brother retired as a captain in the Army. My younger brother was in the Army Reserves. If I didn't get called into ministry, I would have been in the Air Force. The reason that those men and women train the way they do, and the reason why basic training is so intense and so insane, is not so that they're really comfortable when they're sitting on camp. It's so that when the stuff hits the fan, they revert back to their original programming. They can fall back on that basic and ingrained habit. We see this all over. In sports, people practice over and over again free throws and layups and do all of these things. Why? So that when the game is on, they're ready. But then we come to our Christian walk, and we're laissez-faire. It doesn't take, there's no practicing, there's no effort. I'm not suggesting that we do some kind of breaking you down to rebuild you. That's not what I'm suggesting the church discipleship program should be, even though I'm getting nods from Darren. So good luck, youth group. But what I want to say is this. The time to establish how you'll respond to crisis is when you're not in crisis. However, if you find yourself in crisis, Christ is there with you, and so is the church, and so are the great hall of faith. The people who you can read about in the Bible and the people that you can meet who have been faithful through their lives and have also faced storms in their lives. But today, I also want to leave you with 3 things that you can do. I like to give you applicable things that you can take home and actually try. So the first is this. Practice 1. You are not the first one on the ice. I mentioned this earlier, but read a story from Hebrews chapter 11, the great cloud of witnesses. Go back to Hebrews 11 and pick out one of the names you don't know, or pick out one of the names that you've not read in a while, and go back and find that passage that is being referenced in the Old Testament. Go back and read the story that the pastor of Hebrews is talking about. And then come back and read Hebrews 11 and see how the by faith hits differently. And recognize the shoulders of faith that you're standing on. And let their story strengthen yours. So this week, name one, find one name, read one story, and read it before Sunday. Practice number 2, an honest audit. Everyone loves the word audit. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, right? The author, the pastor of Hebrews, doesn't say throw off sin. He says throw off everything that hinders. This is important for us today, especially for those of us who have been living and following Christ for longer than others in here have been alive. Because there are things in our lives that are not sinful in and of themselves, but they are slowing us down. There are distractions and habits, and there's patterns of thinking, things that are consuming the energy that we need to run the race marked out for us. So this week, as an honest audit, I want to encourage you to spend time with God, maybe with a piece of paper or a journal if you're so inclined, and sit there and pray and ask God, what am I carrying that I was never meant to carry? What is the thing that is making the race harder for me than it needs to be? Then write it down. Name it. Naming is the first act of throwing it off. So this week, 20 minutes, a piece of paper or a journal, and an honest question. What is hindering me? And then the hard part. Share it with one other person. Share it so that you can pray about that together and walk with that together. Practice 3, fix your eyes. This is a practice that I have ingrained in myself for well over a decade now. They're called breath prayers. We get them, they're as old as the desert fathers. They're thousands of years old. They're small, simple prayers that help us to return our eyes to Christ, that help us in the midst of the crisis to turn our eyes back to Christ, in the midst of the panic and the anxiety to turn our eyes back to Christ. It's a centering thing. This isn't a magic incantation. This isn't, no. Most of the time, I like to do it based off of Scripture. I find a 5-6 word phrase that I breathe in and breathe out. So as I breathe in, the Lord is my shepherd. Breathe out, I shall not want. That is a breath prayer. That is something to say in the morning when you wake up. That is something to say in the middle of the day. That is something to say as you lay your head down on the pillow. That is something in the midst when the cold is coming in and the ice is starting to creep. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Or, fix my eyes on you. You have already gone ahead. I want to go back to where we started today. 27 men on the ice. No ship, no rescue visible on the horizon, and yet every single one of them held on. Not because the cold got warmer and not because the waiting got easier. They held on because they believed that someone who loved them was still moving out there, was still fighting and still coming. The author, the pastor of Hebrews, wants you to know something today. You are not the first person to be on the ice. Look around you. Look in this room. There are people in this room who have been on ice, have faced life's trials. But also look around you at Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham and Sarah and Moses and Rahab and David. A great cloud of people who held on when holding on made no sense, who ran when they were exhausted, who believed when they could not see. You're standing on their shoulders. You are standing on their shoulders right now. And then look ahead. Don't look at the ice. Don't look at the horizon. But look at the one who's already crossed the horizon. Look at the one who is the pioneer and the forerunner of our faith, the perfecter of our faith, the one who went first into every dark thing that you will ever face, and he came out the other side. And he didn't just survive the race, he finished the race. And he is not watching you from a distance. He came back for you. He came back, and he said, I am with you always, even if you are on ice. Remember, you're not the first one there, and you will not be the last. So throw off what is slowing you down. Fix your eyes on the one who has already gone ahead, and run. Would you pray with me?